Here's the complete narration script for the Nabataean trade network nobody mentions. 899 words, on target. In 106 AD, Rome erased an entire trading empire from the map overnight without a battle worth naming, and the reason why is stranger than the conquest itself. You were taught the Silk Road. You were taught Rome. You were never taught the people who controlled the richest trade corridor on Earth for 400 years and left almost no trace of why they mattered. That's not an accident. That's the point. Here's who they were: the Nabataeans. Arab traders who rose out of the desert around the 4th century BC and built their capital at Petra, carved straight into rose-colored cliffs in the middle of nowhere on purpose. Nobody stumbles onto Petra. You have to already know the way in. From there, they ran the incense trade. Frankincense, myrrh, spices moving from southern Arabia up through the desert to Gaza, Damascus, the Mediterranean. Rome burned through tons of frankincense a year in funerals and temples alone. Every gram of it crossed Nabataean land, and every caravan paid a toll to cross it. They weren't a footnote in someone else's empire. They were the toll booth for the ancient world's most valuable commodity, and almost nobody outside a classics department can name them today. Here's the strange documented fact. The desert between Arabia and the Mediterranean has almost no water. That should have made trade impossible. It didn't, because the Nabataeans built something the Romans themselves admired and couldn't fully replicate: a hidden network of cisterns, dams, and plastered channels that captured every drop of a rare desert rain and stored it for months. Historians have mapped over 100 of these sites. Most of the routes weren't marked. The water stations weren't marked either. You needed to already know where they were, and the Nabataeans made sure almost no one outside their own people did. Guides who talked disappeared from the trade. Competing caravans without water knowledge simply died in the sand. This wasn't luck. It was infrastructure built specifically to be invisible to outsiders, a monopoly enforced by geography and silence, centuries before anyone wrote the word cartel. And it gets stranger. The Nabataeans left almost no written history of their own. No grand king list. No triumphant inscriptions bragging about conquests the way Egypt or Assyria did. What they left instead were tombs, cisterns, and trade contracts. That's it. A civilization wealthy enough to fund Petra's carved temples, treasuries the size of small palaces, chose to write almost nothing down about who they were or how they did it. Modern historians still argue over their language, their origins, even how their kingship actually worked. A culture that controlled the ancient world's most valuable trade route for 4 centuries somehow made itself close to unreadable. That's not primitive. That's deliberate. But here's what doesn't add up. If the Nabataeans were this secretive, this dominant, this rich, why does Rome's own history barely explain why it took them until 106 AD to finally absorb Petra? Rome had legions capable of crushing kingdoms in a single campaign season. They did it to Carthage. They did it to Gaul. Against the Nabataeans, Rome negotiated, married into alliances, waited generations. And when annexation finally came, contemporary Roman writers described it almost apologetically as an addition, not a conquest. You don't write it that way about people you defeated. You write it that way about people you needed. Here's the buried why. Rome didn't erase the Nabataeans because they were weak. Rome absorbed them because Rome needed exactly what the Nabataeans controlled. And once the water routes and trade knowledge were folded quietly into Roman administration, keeping the Nabataean name attached to that system became a liability, not a legacy. A conquered people gets remembered as a lesson. A partner people gets remembered as a threat to imperial pride because it exposes something inconvenient, that Rome's wealth, for centuries, depended on a desert kingdom Rome didn't build and couldn't have replicated alone. Admitting that meant admitting Roman power wasn't purely Roman. So the record shifted. Petra became a curiosity, a ruin, a postcard for later empires, instead of what it actually was, the hidden engine room of ancient global trade. The people who mastered water in a place water shouldn't exist got filed under desert mystery, instead of the reason Rome could afford to burn frankincense by the ton. That reframing wasn't sloppy historiography. It was convenient historiography. Think about what else that implies. If one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced trade networks in the ancient world can be quietly folded out of the narrative because acknowledging it complicates a bigger empire story, what else got the same treatment? Every textbook timeline you were handed skipped straight from great empires of antiquity to the next great empire, like the space between them was empty desert and nothing more. It wasn't empty. It was owned by people whose name got sanded off the sign. How many mysterious desert ruins scattered across your textbook were actually inconvenient economic engines that somebody, somewhere, needed the world to forget? Nobody has ever fully explained why the Nabataeans stopped writing their own history right as their wealth peaked. Maybe they didn't stop. Maybe it just isn't Rome's story to tell, and nobody's gone looking for whose story it actually is. Saved to home/jarvisadmin/Nabataean script txt